We're going to shift a little bit in the course.
We are indeed. This really marks a break point in the course. The first four books that you've read were all set in the context of the great wars of the first half of the 20th century, World War I and World War II. And it is true they were from different national contexts and they took different approaches to the war. But they're all emerging out of a context where everybody who reads the book has some common understanding or perception about the events they're talking about. These are wars that everybody was involved with, whether physically or emotionally or viscerally, however it worked. These are wars that everybody participated in one way or the other.
Like in 1940, everybody knew we were having a
Yeah,
war.
exactly. Then,
Today,
and everybody was a participant in the war. That's
Right.
the point of those propaganda posters, right? To persuade you that
Right.
workers and soldiers are all part of one big national force.
Mm-hmm.
The wars we're going to talk about for the rest of the course, and that the books we're going to read for the rest of the course, those are different. Those are wars that are experienced by a relatively small percentage of the population physically. Mm-hmm. Those are wars in which, and remember these are all American books from here on out, wars in which the American leadership specifically decides not to involve the entire population in the war effort. You're never going to see the kind of propaganda about Vietnam or Iraq that you saw in the posters we showed earlier.
When you ride alone, you ride with Ho Chi Minh.
Yeah,
Never
shows up. You're never asked to sacrifice.
Yeah.
That's the whole point, is that you can have guns and butter.
Right.
And they're wars that are not popular,
Mm-hmm.
at least among a significant percentage of the population for a significant percentage of the time. And they're experiences that simply aren't shared. These are veterans who come back, and the population doesn't want to hear their stories. Right? That's a key difference. The stories that they're telling in the rest of the course are stories that people don't necessarily ask them about. No matter how many times they say thank you for your service, which has become this kind of litany line that you recite at every possible opportunity, a surprising number of people who say that don't actually want a response. Right. And so these are different. And
they're sort of glad that other people are doing all of that work.
And they're appreciative, don't get me wrong.
That they don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. And so it is cliched to say, and I think it's like with most cliches, there's a reason for it,
Mm-hmm.
that the veterans of World War II never wanted to talk about their combat experience. I think that's often true. The difference is that I think many of the veterans of Vietnam never get asked. Right. So it's a very different kind of experience. And I should say, and this is maybe the jumping off to the point to the O'Brien book, it's also an experience, and we've reached a point in the course where at least Dr. Austin and I have personal experience of being alive in that time and remembering some of it. He's slightly older than I am. But what do you remember about Vietnam?
I have one concrete memory of Vietnam, and that was in 1972 or 1973. Mm-hmm. I was in grade school, probably first grade, in Ventura, California, where we lived at the time. Mm-hmm. And I remember a sixth grader coming into our classroom and saying they were doing a survey for the school paper. And the two questions that she had to all of us first graders were, do you think we should get out of Vietnam, and do you think that Nixon should resign?
Wow.
And that might be the only memory I have of either Watergate or Vietnam, except that maybe 5 years later, when I was in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, they were very much a part of the recent past, though I didn't really share those experiences very much. But, I experienced Jimmy Carter, for example, and I remember very clearly the Carter presidency. I don't think I was ever aware how much that presidency was conditioned by Watergate in Vietnam, and as a reaction to it.
And Carter was president from 76 to 80. And I suppose, well, that's maybe a way to get into the topic of Vietnam, is that I guess Vietnam actually wasn't my war as much as I have a war. It was the Cold War. And that Vietnam is an operation or a part of the Cold War. And I was born in 68. And so I have no memories of Vietnam. What I have are memories of the political accusations and arguments that come out of Vietnam, and all of the questions about who lost Vietnam and why did we lose Vietnam, and why are all those damn hippies still complaining. And how does this shape the really important conflict, which is this ideological conflict with the Soviet Union?
And how do they relate? I mean, why don't you
Yeah.
give us
So,
some history
my
here,
guess is
because-
most of you watching this, that there's a generational divide between the two of us and you, because when we grew up, everybody knew that there was a war going on, and that war was between two opposing global systems. One
the bastion
centered
of
around-
virtue and
Yes,
the evil
exactly.
empire.
Yes. Now the question, of course, is which is which.
Yeah.
And we always grew up, of course, convinced that we were the bastion of virtue.
Right.
As I'm sure people in the Soviet Union did as well. And parenthetically, one really useful way to get a sense of this is to watch the TV show The Americans, which is on FX, which is a spectacular show and helps you kind of grasp why the Soviets might have thought that we were the evil empire. But there's two opposing systems, right? The United States, which talks about free markets and about democracy and about liberty, and the Soviet Union, which is always talking about freeing the oppressed and about creating a world where there aren't poor people and so on. Each side had a whole system of alliances that drew other countries toward it. So the Cold War is the political, economic conflict that's dominating the world. And there are a variety of smaller regional conflicts that are all part of this global competition between the East and the West, right? And Vietnam is one of those. And the Vietnam War is really a conflict about who should run Vietnam and about what system should run Vietnam. And the background to this, the deep history of this is very complicated.
Isn't it all the French's fault?
The French were the ones who colonized that region of Asia, right, that now is Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and Vietnam.
Indochina, right?
Indochina in the mid to late 1800s.
Okay.
It is to some degree liberated, if that's the word you want to use, by the Japanese, who then just take over control of it themselves in the late 30s. But World War II ends, the Japanese leave, and nobody quite knows what to do with it. The French try and take it over again, and a group of Vietnamese rebels kick them out. That's in 1954. And because this is a theater in a broader war, like this is the only reason the Americans care, right? Really, is that this is a theater where the Soviet Union and the United States, communism, right? That's the ideology, the political system of the Soviet Union, democracy. This is a place where those ideals are competing for influence and for support, and that's why people care.
Now, is the other side in the Vietnam War as supported by the Soviets as?
It's very complicated, but more or less, yes. So the very brief answer to the complication is that there's two parts to this. Starting in the 50s, there's two parts or two centers of global communism. One is the Soviet Union, one is the Chinese. Each of them want to be the leader of the communist bloc. And so there's some complications about who's going to support who. But the simple answer is that, the Vietnamese communists centered in the north of the country. And in fact, there is a regional division that's cemented as the French League between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And the northern part of the country is communist and supported by the communist bloc. And the southern part of the country is supported by the United States. I don't think it's possible to call it democratic, even though it has elections. It's very corrupt, both economically and politically.
So it's autocracy.
But rhetorically, it's democratic, and so we have to support it.
Because we have to oppose
communism. Right? And the metaphor that is consistently invoked is the idea of dominance, right? So Vietnam stands down toward the end of that peninsula, and the fear is that if Vietnam becomes communist, then Cambodia will become communist, and Malaysia will become communist, and Indonesia will become communist, and so on and so on and so on.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the experience of the soldier in Vietnam, and then let's spend the rest of the time on
right. So that is the other difference between the books we've been looking at and the books that we will be looking at from this point on, right? Mm-hmm. Is that the experience of the four authors, well, maybe not of Dresden, but the other three, our experience is kind of traditional combat as it's discussed in history books, and right with set piece battles and with everybody part of a organization with an enemy they can point to. Vietnam is different. In the same way that not Iraq in the first war or the first 6 months of the second war, but Iraq in '05 or '06 was, right, where this is a non-traditional insurgent conflict, right? And so the people you're fighting in Vietnam, you will occasionally see people that are part of the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, but most of the time they're what we would call guerrillas. And they may fight all the time, but many of them are members of a village, and then at night will go off and set mines, and then in the daytime will come back and plant and harvest and do all the things villagers do. They may use women or children as scouts. It's almost impossible for Americans to figure out who the enemy is.
And the enemy isn't behind a line somewhere.
Yeah, that's right.
So
there might be anywhere.
So they could be
and
just
could
as
be at
likely
any
to
time.
be in the South as in the North.
Yep.
Okay. So
and
what did the soldier do in Vietnam? What did a day consist of?
depending on who you are. So one of the things about this novel is what you will discover in the memoir is that he spends the last 3 or 4 or 5 months of his career in Vietnam. And remember, these are 12-month tours. That's another difference, right? You didn't sign up till the end of the war. You got drafted for a year, and then you went home. And so one of the things that O'Brien's going to be wrestling with, in the same way that Phil Clay or, sorry, I'm forgetting her name, Heidi Squire Craft are going to be, is that they go home, and the war's not done, and there are no parades, and they go home by themselves, generally. And then they just go back to their family, and they try and pick up their lives the way they were without any sense of closure and without any way to process this. So many of the people were clerks, right? Or supply sergeants, or people who worked in the rear areas who occasionally would experience a fear because a mortar shell would land near them, but didn't fight. O'Brien's an infantryman. And his experience, and you'll see this, right, is humping, right? Which is a word that means something different than your slang means today, right? Humping to them means hiking, and it means carrying stuff, trying to go out and find the enemy, trying to go out and set ambushes, trying to go out and inspect a village to see if you can see evidence of the enemy having been there, trying to flush people out and killing them, or trying to get information. Of course, trying to get information means often from the wives and children of a village because the men are gone.
Right. So there aren't battles that we're used to.
There are few battles.
Very few battles.
There are a small number that are important, but in terms of understanding the O'Brien book, that's not his experience.
He seems to be walking around and occasionally blowing stuff up and occasionally getting blown up.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's where you do it. You go to sleep, you do it again.
And he almost seems just like a part of a roving band of intelligence officers / combatants, and then there tends to be a lot of rage against civilians. I mean, let's look at the first story, the things they carried. And these stories, let me say a little bit about the novel, because it may or may not really be a novel. A lot of these stories were published separately in magazines and then assembled into the novel. All of the stories use the same cast of characters. There's a rough but by no means exact chronological order to the story. But what it is in a lot of places is what we call metafiction, which is fiction about fiction, or stories about stories. That this is a story about how you tell stories and what stories do. And here, in the things they carried, you have a story that's a very stark story. This guy named Lavender steps on a landmine and dies, and then the patrol massacres an entire village because of it. But he's holding that so tight that it just sort of seeps out around the edges, because that's what he doesn't want to say. So he talks about the things they carried. And that word carried has multiple meanings, and he explores every one of them. First he starts talking about what's in their bags, what's on their belts, what do they carry, but he also talks about the secrets that they carry, the guilt that they carry, the expectations of society that they carry, that there's just so much in here that's so powerful.
And when you start this story, you don't know that, right? So you
Right.
start the story and you think, oh, this is a story about the kind of common everyday experience of the infantrymen. And he's talking about the things they carry as a way to help you understand how heavy this stuff is when you're humping through the bush.
Yeah, and he's very precise about it.
Yep. And then all of a sudden, he goes back to this death from a variety of different
He
perspectives.
keeps circling around.
Yeah.
He mentioned it. Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside of the village of Tom Kay in mid-April. Until he was shot, Ted Lavender carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope, which for him was a necessity. At page 3. In April, for instance, when Ted Lavender was shot, they used his poncho to wrap him up and then to carry him across the paddy to lift him into the chopper that took him away.
Mm-hmm.
So he just keeps coming back to this, and the details of the story emerge gradually amidst everything else. And that's because these are babies.
Mm-hmm.
These are children. These are 18, 19. Who's the kid who blew up the dog?
Mm-hmm.
And then says, why is everybody mad at me? I'm just a kid.
Yeah.
That's a powerful
What
moment.
kind of responsibility do I have?
Why do I have to have responsibility for the life and death of dogs and villagers?
Yeah. And it's an interesting because by the time you're done, well, I lied because I'm going to go back on that. Because a couple stories later, you're going to get to this idea that what he's really carrying, the circle has gone out, or the spiral has gone out far enough that he's now talking about his grown daughter, asking why he's carrying these things. And he doesn't use that word in the story that's 2 stories down, but that's really what he's talking about, right? Yeah. Is why are you so obsessed? Why are you still carrying these memories of this war that happened to you 20 years ago, or 30 years ago? That was only a year of your life.
Yeah, and we get a sense of this that that the memories are suppressed, both for psychological reasons, but also for sociological reasons. The memories of the individual soldiers are repressed. The national memory of Vietnam is suppressed because it didn't work out very well. And so I've seen, even though I lived much closer to Vietnam War, I have seen many more movies and read many more books about World War II, which is really celebrated in our national memory. I mean, when I was a kid, I went to Andrew Carnegie Elementary School, celebrating capitalism, and then Chester Nimitz Junior High School.
Oh, wow. Chester Nimitz, of course, was an admiral who led the Central Pacific Drive across the Pacific.
Right. So, and I don't, never went to a school named after a...
and the iconic movie about, or one of the 2 or 3 iconic movies about Vietnam is called Platoon, right? And this is a movie where the soldiers do kind of catastrophically bad things. And the American soldiers. It's not a worshiping of the American soldier. It is an indictment of the American soldier.
And that's here too. Though even what exactly they did, afterward they burned Thon Cay, they marched until dusk and dug their holes. And that night, Kiowa kept explaining how you had to be there, how fast it was, how poor guy just dropped. So he just slips in the fact that they burned down a whole village. And doesn't say massacred all of the people, but that's the clear implication is that in retaliation for their friend dying, they massacred an entire village, and he can barely even bring himself to say that or even to hint at it. So it's not what happened to them as much as what they did
Yeah, that's
to other people.
Yeah, and so there's a couple ways to read that, and that's one. The other way is to think of it as he's saying it matter-of-factly. Of course we did this. And that's just the way the war was. We don't have to give the details. We don't have to explain because that's the character of the war. And that's what we carried, is that became normal.
We carried who we became.
Yeah.
And then the question is, can you become somebody else again after that?
And this goes back, right, to All Quiet on the Western Front, where he says at the beginning that we have become somebody else. We cannot change that. And that, in some ways, is O'Brien's question: is can we go back to being normal?
I mean, the classic movie of this is First Blood.
Mm-hmm.
Sylvester Stallone comes back from the Vietnam War, and everyone treats him like a dirty, hippie, homeless, psychotic veteran. Nobody wants to deal with him. So he just starts, setting up shop and taking down the whole town.
Yeah.
Because he can't be the person he was before, and he can't be really a functioning part of society anymore, because this war turned him into... Now, in World War II, that absolutely wasn't the case. Most of the people in World War II came home, went to college on the GI Bill, became insurance salesmen and executives.
Now, there's some dirty little secrets there, right? Because it's
Yeah.
clear that a lot of them suffered from what we now would call PTSD. And so there's all these stories about World War II vets who wake up screaming in the middle of the night, who end up beating their wives or become alcoholics. But I think that's the second two are far less frequent than what is most typical for World War II vets is suppressing that fear and that response because that war was believed to be a victory and they were believed to be heroes, and it would be a sign of weakness not to be a whole person again. Right. In Vietnam, nobody expects you to be a hero, and the war wasn't a victory. And there is some social pressure not to talk about it, but if you respond badly to it, well, of course you would have responded badly to a war that was so screwed up.
Right. So the memory of Vietnam, the national memory of Vietnam, is going to condition people's personal memories of what happens. Because we remember things selectively. And when we tell stories, we choose our stories selectively. And let's look at
There's just, as you flip to that, there's one, and this is a TV show that hadn't been on for a long time, and I'm sure you can Netflix it, but it's not a bad TV show called China Beach, which is kind of the MASH of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a comedy. It can't be a comedy. And they ran out of, this is my guess anyway, it was a pretty popular show while they set it in Vietnam, but they made a decision to bring it home and to transition to after the war.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really good.
Really.
And all of a sudden, nobody watched, because nobody wanted to watch the struggle of the people who came back home.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of moment there where some of the people who had been in this hospital in Vietnam meet back up together, and one of them has become a pretty intense Christian, and the female nurse's character, played by Daniel Delaney, can look at him and say, "I'm glad that works for you, but it doesn't work for me, and I can't find anything that works for me."
They did that with MASH too.
Yeah,
They had this
I
thing
never
called
watched
After
MASH.
MASH. Well, it's because it sucked.
Yeah, well,
I mean, they were just trying to squeeze a few more bucks out of the franchise.
Mm-hmm.
But MASH was about Vietnam too, even though
Yes,
it was
it
set
was.
in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it starts in 1973. The movie is, 69, 70. So really, MASH is just the Vietnam War sentiment set in the Korean War.
And the distinction, I think, is that it had to be a comedy or a satire, or because people were not completely convinced that the Vietnam War was a tragedy. China Beach could be a drama because everybody knew it was a tragedy. So you didn't have to use comedy to make that point.
And you remember Baba Black Sheep with Robert
Yes.
Conrad,
Mm-hmm.
Bombers in World War II,
Mm-hmm.
which was just sort of like the Dukes of Hazzard in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How to tell a true war story, and that's page 64. And I think, at least in the first half of the book, this is the core of what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, here's how you tell a true war story, and what he says about it isn't completely consistent, but some definite things come out. A true war story is never moral.
Mm-hmm.
And he means this, I think, in two different ways. It doesn't come to a nice moral at the end, but also it doesn't. The language is going to be coarse. What happens is going to be vulgar. He says here, as a first, this is page 65, if at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, and you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie.
Which I think has to be a reference to the old.
Has to be a reference to the Owen poem, but the old lie, dulce et decorum est. There's no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. And then he says at some point here, if you don't care for obscenity, you don't care for the truth. If you don't care for the truth, watch how you vote. Send guys to war, they come home talking dirty. So why, that's not my experience of World War II either, at least how I remember it.
It's not. So this is, actually, I don't know. I've never thought about this before, but I'm wondering if, given O'Brien's kind of literary bent, he's in some ways kind of engaging more of a Holocaust discussion about how you can't have art after the Holocaust. And you cannot have stories that draw some kind of moral conclusion out of the Holocaust, because it's just not. It is what you're doing when you find morale at some kind of heroic story, say Schindler's List, out of the Holocaust, is that you're really finding that for yourself. It's not there for the people there. You are drawing the lesson out of it, the moral out of it. If you feel uplifted, it's because you need to feel uplifted as the person who's reading the story. And that's kind of what he says, right? If you get that out of a war story, it's because you need it, not because it's in the war story. And if the author has provided you what you need, he's not giving you a true picture of what happened. Now, I do think, so one of the ways, I think that fits very well with the Manchester book, okay, in the sense that I think he's very clear that the experience of war didn't make him feel heroic. The experience of conflict didn't make him a better person. But I do think, so on one level, I think that's a universal. On another level, I think it is shaped by the particular war he fought in, because I think there are particular conflicts where one outcome is a better outcome than another, and you can say even if the experience of war was awful for the individuals, it was a sacrifice worth making. And I think that's the interpretation of World War II, is that the soldiers we sent off, it was a horrible experience, but it was worth it.
Right. So again, we're getting to, once we reconstruct everything in the light of history, the memories are going to be better, even if the day-to-day experience wasn't. Because certainly the day-to-day experience of the guy in Okinawa isn't going to be any better than this.
And
But
if you actually read a lot of memoirs about the Second World War, you really get that feeling that the value and the moral, the legacy, I guess is the word I'm looking for, isn't felt at the time. All that's felt in the time is misery.
So we have this, I think, really bizarre story at the end, where Lemon is killed, and then Rat takes a small water buffalo home and tortures it by just inflicting pain on it. And at the very end, they sort of get the punchline. It wasn't a war story; it was a love story.
What's he mean by that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that he's saying something like, this is the only way he can express his love for his friend after his friend dies, is to find an innocent creature and inflict great pain on it. And I can't understand feeling like that, but because I've never been in this kind of a situation. But I think he wants us to understand that that's the level of raw emotional experience that an 18-year-old goes through when his best friend is killed. And if torturing a water buffalo is all you can do to show your love, something has happened to you. that shouldn't happen to 18-year-olds. Or back to the first story, the lieutenant who feels perpetually that that Lavender died because he was thinking about his girlfriend instead of watching the perimeter. You know, and he was a 24-year-old kid, and so I think that level of guilt has to be dealt with, and one of the only ways to deal with it is to become a different kind of person.
It does make you wonder. Here's this story about what a true war story is, and then he says, well, this wasn't actually a true war story, but he's been using it as a lens to understand what a true war story is.
And that's the thing. He's telling us about true war stories in what is a work of fiction. So inherently, there's that irony. But, and we've gotten to this before, I think we've got to this with Vonnegut, certainly, true is not the same as historically accurate. That he's trying to convey a truth beyond what happened, you know, what the raw historical facts are, and whether or not some guy named Rat Kiley ever tortured a water buffalo, that story can tell a truth. And that truth is something we have to grapple with in order to understand how O'Brien's experiencing the war. Okay, I think that covers it for today. Keep reading until the end of the novel, and we will be back soon.